Hello, my name is Corey Edmund Engelat. I'm an independent researcher, I'm an author of 2 different books, I'm part of the One Great Work Network, and I'm here to share a very important message: how slavery still exists today. What is slavery? Why we must pay attention to it, because, well, we're not going to be free if we don't understand what slavery is, if we are enslaved and don't realize that we are, if we are allowing slavery and don't realize that we are. There's many different components to this, and I can summarize it for you in this video. When Americans traditionally think of slavery, they think of chattel slavery, the ball and chain slavery that took place, particularly involving the ownership of African Americans. However, slavery has existed for thousands of years, spanning nearly every part of the world. When chattel slavery existed, it was seen as natural and essential to society, a world unimaginable without it, due to its long history and great contribution to the economy. Let us explore the origins of slavery and the nature of slavery. Today, chattel slavery still exists, but in certain locations or occupations, and among other forms of slavery. The birthplace of slavery is considered to have taken place in Sumeria, or ancient Mesopotamia, the world's first and oldest civilization, with also the oldest known law code, called the Code of Ur-Nammu. Since the creation of Sumeria, every civilization practiced slavery thereafter, and it was known as an established institution. The laws would be put in place for equity and truth. That's a quote. As it says in the Law Code of Ur-Nammu, or, quote, to prevent the strong from oppressing the weak, as it says in the Law Code of Hammurabi. However, these claims would be made whilst the same civilizations practiced slavery openly, deciding for their slaves what their rights are, deciding upon their own whims what their punishments are to be. The rulers of these civilizations were seen as having the divine right to rule, as they were often headed by a priest class. If at any time a slave tried to escape, there would be rewards for freer peoples by law to recapture the slave. In the 19th century, the people given the specific task by their rulers were called the slave patrol, and they are considered among the origins of modern-day policing. The king or ruler of these different civilizations would be in ultimate control over those considered free or those considered slaves. They would have the imagined power to be the ones to grant others their freedom. This was called manumission or enfranchisement. Historically, people have become slaves as a result of war or government jailing systems, if not born into a slave family or endured unpaid labor. In the 19th century, chattel slavery in the aggregate of society was abolished, primarily by the cause of abolitionism. However, if somebody in today's world becomes imprisoned by their rulers or government, slavery can be used as the punishment for crime. Statistically, about 80% of all modern imprisoned peoples are from victimless crimes. May even be more than that. 19th century abolitionist and lawyer Lysander Spooner would differentiate the crime, that which causes harm to another person's life or property, from a vice, a victimless act, which does potential harm to one's own life or property, in his writing Vices Are Not Crimes, a Vindication of Moral Liberty, from 1875. If it weren't for the many abolitionists in the 19th century, like Lysander Spooner, sounding the alarms about chattel slavery, it could have continued en masse to this day. But these same abolitionists also warned of other forms of slavery. With insight into the origins of slavery, we may also define the very nature of slavery. 19th century abolitionist Henry Clark Wright states that slavery is, quote, submission or subjection to control by the will of another being. Professor Kevin Bales states that, quote, slavery is theft, theft of a life, theft of work, theft of any property or produce, theft even of the children a slave might have borne. The 19th century abolitionist Ezra Haywood states that, quote, slavery is voluntary or involuntary. voluntary when one sells or yields his or her own property to the irresponsible will of another, and involuntary when placed under the absolute power of another without one's own consent. One of the greatest writers of all time, so-called, and the late abolitionist philosopher Leo Tolstoy wrote, quote, "The necessity to do what other people wish against your own will is slavery, and therefore as long as any violence designed to compel some people to do the will of others exists, there will be slavery." Another 19th century abolitionist, Salmon Chase, states, quote, "Slavery is the complete and absolute subjection of one person to the control and disposal of another person by legalized force. We need not argue that no person can be rightfully compelled to submit to such control and disposal. All such subjugation must originate in force, and private force not being strong enough to accomplish the purpose, public force in the form of law must lend its aid. The government comes to the help of the individual slaveholder, and punishes resistance to his will, and compels submission. The government, therefore, in the case of every individual slave, is the real enslaver, depriving each person enslaved of all liberty and all property and all that makes life dear. For slavery cannot subsist a moment after the support of the public force has been withdrawn." Lysander Spooner, when talking about the U.S. Civil War, stated, quote, "The pretense that the, quote, abolition of slavery was either a motive or justification for the war is a fraud of the same character with that of, quote, maintaining the national honor. Who but such usurpers, robbers, and murderers as they ever established slavery? Or what government, except one resting upon the sword, like the one we have now, was ever capable of maintaining slavery? And why did these men abolish slavery? Not from any love of liberty in general, not as an act of justice to the black man himself, but only as, quote, a war measure, and because they wanted his assistance, and that of his friends, in carrying on the war they had undertaken for maintaining and intensifying that political, commercial, and industrial slavery to which they have subjected the great body of the people, both white and black. And yet, these impostors now cry out that they have abolished the chattel slavery of the black man, although that was not the motive of the war, as if they thought they could thereby conceal, atone for, or justify that other slavery which they were fighting to perpetrate, and to render more rigorous and inexorable than it was ever before. There was no difference of principle, but only of degree, between the slavery they boast to have abolished and the slavery they were fighting to preserve. For all restraints upon men's natural liberty, not necessary for the simple maintenance of justice, are of the nature of slavery and differ from each other only in degree. From etymology, the word slave comes from the late 13th century as a person who is the chattel or property of another. From Old French esclave, from medieval Latin slavus, slave, source also from Italian schiavo, French slave, Spanish slavo, and originally Slav, due to the many Slavs sold into slavery by conquering peoples. The word slavery based upon this comes from the 16th century, referring to severe toil, hard work, drudgery, also meaning a state of servitude. Therefore, we must ask ourselves, if claiming 100% ownership of someone's property is slavery, what percentage isn't? If taking 100% of someone's property is theft, what percentage isn't? Is there any means by which any number of individuals can delegate to someone else the moral right to do something which none of the individuals have the moral right to do themselves? Do those who wield political power, presidents, legislators, etc., have the moral right to do things which other people do not have the moral right to do? If so, from whom and how did they acquire such a right? Is there any process, constitutions, elections, legislation, by which human beings can transform an immoral act into a moral act without changing the act itself? When lawmakers and law enforcers use coercion and force in the name of law and government, do they bear the same responsibility for their actions that anyone else would who did the same on his own? When there is a conflict between an individual's own moral conscience and the commands of a political authority, is the individual morally obligated to do what he personally views as wrong in order to obey the law? Can slavery be limited if it's seen as legitimate? Perhaps the world needs to take another look at slavery. Think for yourself, as you should. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you look more into this information. Slavery can be a complex topic, but I think you know what it is about, and we do learn a little bit about it in school. Well, let's add on to that. Is chattel slavery just one form of slavery? Are there other forms of slavery? And what is slavery to begin with? If you need to, rewatch this video, rewind, and really look into these subjects, because everything I mentioned was either a question or a fact. And if you don't think that's the case, prove me wrong. Thank you very much. I'm a modern abolitionist. My name is Corey Edmund Nengelat. Nature is the answer. NITA.ONE.